So when it comes to the resurrection, why is resurrection proof of divinity? So Lazarus is resurrected.
A miracle taken in isolation is inherently ambiguous. The proper interpretation of a miracle is going to be given by the religio-historical context in which it occurs. And the resurrection of Jesus is not just the resurrection of any old body. It's the resurrection of the man who claimed to be Messiah, Son of God, and Son of Man, and who was crucified for those allegedly blasphemous claims. If God has raised this man from the dead, then he has, I think, unequivocally and publicly vindicated those allegedly blasphemous claims.
Now, I agree here with William Lane Craig that the resurrection acts as Jesus' vindication. He is wrongly put to death on the cross, and so God raises him back to life to vindicate him and his claims. Now, with this, a second point needs to be made, and that is Jesus' resurrection is different from the other raising to lives that we see in the New Testament. So when Jesus raises Lazarus back to life in John 11, it's important to note that this is essentially a resuscitation, that Lazarus returns to the state that he was in before he died. But with Jesus, it's quite different. Jesus enters into his glorified state. And there's a few interesting things about this resurrected body of Jesus. We see that Jesus can walk through walls. We see that Jesus can disguise his identity. So this indicates that Jesus' resurrection is not simply a resuscitation, but there's something extra, there's something unique about this claim that Jesus has been raised from the dead. He's entered into his glorified state.
So one of the counterclaims to some of this is that the Gospels are written significantly after Jesus lives. Even the earliest Gospel is written, 70 CE? 40 years after Jesus is crucified. So what's to say, that like most historical events, there is some play in the joints here.
What I would argue is that underlying the inference to the resurrection of Jesus are three great independently established facts, which are supported by the historical evidence. And these facts would be that after his crucifixion, that Jesus' tomb was discovered empty on the first day of the week by a group of his female followers. Secondly would be that various individuals and groups of people then witnessed appearances of Jesus alive. And finally, number three would be that the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead, despite having every predisposition to the contrary.
Now, William Lane Craig here says that there's three elements that lead us to think that Jesus has been raised from the dead: the empty tomb, the appearances, and the belief that Jesus was God. Now, really, the central one in this is the appearances. That it is the consistent witness of the New Testament authors that they saw Jesus after his crucifixion and burial, that they saw Jesus raised from the dead. Now, this is a firm historical fact. They claimed to see Jesus raised from the dead. And we really must ask ourselves, what do we do with this claim that they saw Jesus raised from the dead? Now, one of the major counterclaims to this is that they are experiencing grief-induced hallucinations. And you can see how this may be true for his closest disciples, although there is a little bit of discussion around whether groups of people, for instance, 11 people, can have a group hallucination. This is unlikely. But even beyond that, I think there's an even greater weakness to this hallucination theory, and that is the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul, before he saw Jesus on the Damascus Road, did not have any grief about the death of Jesus. So the grief hallucination theory really breaks down when we consider the Apostle Paul's testimony that he saw Jesus. So considering the Apostle Paul, I personally don't see the grief-induced hallucination idea or concept as really holding any water. And so we're left with the resurrection of Jesus. We're left with these claims. They claim to have seen the resurrection of Jesus. And either we shrug our shoulders and say, we don't know, or we're led to believe that, in fact, Jesus was raised from the dead. Hey, if you've enjoyed this video, I've actually produced another video on the events that happened after the death of Jesus, the ascension of Jesus, and why this is overlooked by many Christians, which you can access here. And if you've enjoyed this video, consider subscribing, like the video, and if you think there's something that I've overlooked, please leave a comment.